relax and smile.
Okay. पावन गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये पावन गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये पावन गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये ये जीवनदर शङ्कासं जीवनदर शङ्कासं कृष्णं कोलोगेशं जीवनदर शङ्कासं कृष्णं कोलोगेशं भाविद नारद गिरीशं त्रिभुवनावनावे शम्भाविद नारद गिरीशं त्रिभुवनावनावे शम्पावन गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये ये भूजितविति पुरन्तरं राजिदमुरलीधरं भूजितविति पुरन्तरं राजिदमुरलीधरं व्रजललानन्दतरम् अजितमुतारं कृष्णा व्रजललानन्दतरम् अजितमुतारं कृष्णा निरवधि शुभदाकारम् निरवधि शुभदाकारं विरगदि करुणापूरं निरवधि शुभकारं विरगदि करुणापूरं राधावदन सकोरं लालिदासोदरं परं राधावदन सकोरं लालिदासोदरं परं पावन गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये गुरु पवन पुराधीश माश्रये ये
We are now at the center of the C.P. Ramaswamy AIAR Foundation, where we'll be having our conference for the second and third days. Dr. AIAR was a prominent intellectual and statesman of South India in the early 20th century. He was a great lover of culture, not just Indian culture, but all sorts of intellectual activity from all over the world was of interest to him. There is an extensive library here, and his own writings are also housed here. So it's very appropriate that we have our proceedings on the Bhagavata Purana here, and I'm sure he would also have been very happy to host this event.
Once again, thank you all so much for this, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
So I'm now speaking with Professor Ravi M. Gupta, the Charles Redd Professor of Religion at Utah State University in Utah, USA. better known to me as Ravi, with whom I've been working, collaborating for a long time on 2 books on the Bhagavata Purana. Even though we know so much of what we think, of what we each think of the Bhagavata Purana, I'll again ask, what is the Bhagavata Purana?
The Bhagavata Purana is 18,000 verses. Traditionally, that's the count, and it's a couple hundred chapters, doing what all of the Puranas do on some level. It's talking about the passage of time through history, and this includes both earthly time and cosmic time as it moves through various ages, and various kings, both human and divine, are born, they rule, they die, and the avatars of Vishnu descend to earth, where they engage in lila, or their sport. And it's that journey that really is the main topic of any Purana. Now, the Bhagavata is special because it carries many characteristics that are unusual for a typical Purana. Its language is extraordinarily poetic. While all Puranas are written in poetry, the Bhagavata's poetry is particularly rich with ornamentation, with longer meters, and other alliteration, other poetic ornaments. It also has very difficult vocabulary that is, as you know from our translation work, it's not an easy task to translate the Bhagavata. It's often considered a test of a person's Sanskrit learning. It also self-consciously goes back to the Vedic texts and thinks of itself as part of the Vedic tradition, and uses therefore a lot of grammatical forms from the Vedas as well as references to Vedic passages. So it's a work of the Puranic style, but different in many ways. The Bhagavata's frame story, I think, is part of what makes it so relevant and so popular. It's a story that I think many of us can identify with on several levels. Basically, a group of sages has gathered at a juncture in human time. And that juncture is the transition from the age of Dwapara, the third age, which is still a decent time, to the age of Kali, our present age, which is a dark age, and where things go downhill on many levels, especially the moral quality of human beings. And these sages gather specifically with the question of how is it that people of this age can find direction and light in their lives. And the answer they receive is in the form of the Bhagavata Purana.
And the Bhagavata Purana is, we understand, at least 1,000 years old. Exactly dating the Bhagavata is a matter of debate, but at least 1,000 years the Bhagavata has been studied, it's been narrated, it's been translated into so many different languages, it's been reformed into so many languages. Why? What is it about the Bhagavata that makes this so engaging?
I think there are a lot of things that one might point to. One of my favorite is the Bhagavata's really beautiful juxtaposition of intense or dense philosophical reflection with exquisite poetry. I've found that often works of poetry tend not to be very systematic in their reflection in the way that a philosopher would look forward to. And philosophical works are often not very good literature to read. They can be difficult and dense to get through. The Bhagavata has a way of combining both elements that make it attractive to a variety of different audiences and make it very accessible to vernacularization in dance and music and drama, at the same time attractive to those who want to do a more rarefied study of doctrine and ideas in theology. And that's the Bhagavata's ability to speak to multiple audiences, I think, is really what has sustained it and allowed it to flourish over millennia.
We also realized as we translated that it's very much a didactic work. It's teaching. What is it teaching? What does it want us? What does it want its readers to understand or to... Does it want us to change the way we live? Does it want us to transform our outlook on the world? What is it trying to accomplish?
Well, I mean, I guess the best way to answer that would be to point to not the outermost frame story, but the story within that, which really provides the reason for the Bhagavata's existence. There's a king named Parikshit, and he is the heir to the Pandavas of Mahabharata fame. After the Pandavas have retired, he's left with the throne of Hastinapur. One day he goes out into the forest, ends up very tired, hungry and thirsty, and decides to go into the ashram, the hut of a sage who might give him water and a place to rest. Unfortunately, the sage is in deep meditation, and so instead of greeting the king, he ignores him, or so it appears to Parikshit. Parikshit, in a moment of anger and disappointment, finds a dead snake lying outside the hermitage and places it around the neck of the king as in a moment of anger.
As a necklace.
Yes, as a necklace, and leaves. The sage's son returns to find this snake and figures out pretty quickly that this is the work of a visitor. And without knowing who this visitor is or what the consequences of his anger are going to be, the sage's son proceeds to curse the king to die in 7 days. And that news reaches the king, who instead of becoming angry or upset, instead of finding a way to stop the effects of the curse, decides to accept it wholeheartedly and prepare for his final days. So he heads to the bank of the Ganga, the Ganges River, and there he proceeds to fast for 7 days and 7 nights to await his death. Sages and gods from around the cosmos arrive in that place to be with the king as he's ready to depart his mortal coil. And they're there until the sage Shuka arrives. Now, sage Shuka, as soon as he enters the arena, he's greeted with a whole lot of respect, despite the fact that he's a young man, maybe 16, 17 years old, and not wearing a shred of clothing. And he shows up there, and people recognize him a wisdom that is greater than anyone else present. King Parikshit bows before him and asks him a question which becomes the motivation for the entire Bhagavata, which is, what is the duty of a man who is about to die? What am I supposed to do, someone who's about to die? And of course he is. 7 days is all he has. But if we think of that question more broadly, we might recognize the fact that the question really applies to every person. We're all about to die, after all. For some of us, it may be 7 days, for some 7 years, and for some 70. But at some point, this question is relevant to all of us. And so it's with that thrust that the Bhagavatam begins. It makes itself relevant to people, and then proceeds to provide an answer to that question by saying that the duty of a person in that situation, our situation, is to cultivate bhakti or devotion for Krishna, for Vishnu, for the divine. And that bhakti is powerful enough, when it is selfless, it is powerful enough to reverse, to trump all other considerations of social status, of caste, of gender, of one's species even, whether one is human or animal or a demon. It doesn't make a difference. That bhakti is what we seek and which will really satisfy the self.
You mentioned human condition, and there are stories in the Bhagavata which really focus on the weakness of humans. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, the Bhagavata has a very lofty message, one that asks us to renounce the world and its sensual pleasures in favor of selfless devotion to God and to devote oneself to that life. And yet that message has resonated with so many types of people, I think largely because the Bhagavata has a very down-to-earth, a very honest appraisal of human nature. It recognizes the fact that human beings are weak, that we have our shortcomings and our desires and our aspirations, and that despite all of this, we can better ourselves, we can cure the human condition, we can achieve the ultimate good. And the stories abound in such accounts of kings, of devotees, of persons who have good intentions. They set off to do the right thing. They're heroic even, but they end up stumbling and falling along the way because of some weakness they have. Maybe it's desire, maybe it's anger, whatever it might be. Maybe it's physical weakness. They stumble, and in that moment of stumbling, it actually becomes an opportunity for them to deepen their bhakti, their devotion, by calling out to Krishna, to Vishnu, for his grace. And as a result, they recover from that stumble, come back stronger, and achieve the goal that they want to. And it's that process of taking in human nature, examining it, and allowing for it, I think, that we see, that readers can see themselves in the text and then attempt to apply it.
You and I have shared work, collaborated on an abridged Bhagavatam translation. I translated some portions, you translated some portions. I think we each had our favorite episodes or sections that we translated. So what would be one of your favorites? Can you explain something about the content of that?
That's a difficult question. I had so much fun translating the Bhagavata, particularly collaboratively. I recommend that to anyone. But it was a joyful experience, a difficult one at times as well. And not because of you, because of my own lack of learning and struggle with the language of the Bhagavata. But if I had to choose one passage, I would choose Book 3, Chapter 15, which describes the fall of Jaya and Vijaya, the gatekeepers of Vaikuntha, which is Vishnu's supreme abode, beyond the pale of this world. Their fall from heaven, from grace to earth, to become demons. And it's that chapter was particularly attractive to me for a number of reasons. One is the descriptions of Vaikuntha, of the supreme heaven of Vishnu, that is the Bhagavata so richly describes in its poetry, from the constructed dimensions of it, like the palaces and all inlaid with jewels and gilded with gold, to the natural elements, the trees and creepers and mountains and rivers. In fact, I did some investigating as to the nature of the plants and trees that are there, and it seems to me that the plants favored by the Bhagavata are one that grow in watery environments, and so the vision that the Bhagavata has of Vaikuntha seems to be a moist and watery type of environment. But also the question of Jaya and Vijaya's fall from this perfect world. How could that happen, particularly to gatekeepers who are attendants of Vishnu and very dear to him? And the commentators get deeply involved in this question of who is to blame for their fall. Is it their fault? Is it the people, the sages who cursed them? Or is it ultimately Vishnu's fault? Because after all, he's running the show. It's all his leela, his play.
And I know you as a wonderful reciter of Sanskrit. It may be nice if you could recite for us the first verse, the very first verse of the Bhagavata, which sets the stage for the entire remainder of the book.
Yes. So I think the Bhagavata right at the outset, in the first 3 verses, it really shows this juxtaposition between philosophical thought and poetic expression that I was talking about earlier. And the first verse in particular is really it's very dense in its expression. It uses a long meter called Shardula Vikriditam, and then proceeds to fill that meter with short statements akin to sutras, aphorisms that are difficult to understand on their own without plenty of interpretation. And indeed, there have been extensive commentaries on this first verse. And then by the time we get to the 3rd verse of the Bhagavata, it has quickly switched its concern to the tasting of rasa, of intensified emotion that is very, yes, it's very different from the philosophical tones of the first verse. So anyway, here's how that first verse goes. Janmadhyasya yatonvayaditaratas chartheshvabhignya swarat. Janmadhyasya yatonvayaditaratas chartheshvabhignya swarat. Tene brahma hridaya adikavaye muhyanti yat suraya. Tejo vari mridam yatha vinamayo yatra trisargo mrisha. Dhamna svena sada nirasta kuhakam satyam param dhimahi. Dhamna svena sada nirasta kuhakam satyam param dhimahi.
Very nice.
I just point out 2 things in this first verse that are significant. The first 3 words, Janma Dyasya Yataha, recall the Vedānta Sutra, which is one of the most important philosophical works in the Vedānta tradition, which has been the dominant philosophical tradition, a theistic tradition for the past 1,000 years or so in India. It quotes right there, Janmadhyasya Yataha. The Supreme is that entity from which everything is born, in which it exists or persists, and which it finally returns. And then the final 3 words, Satyam Param Dhimahi. That word Dhimahi recalls the Gayatri mantra, which is so important for the Vedic tradition.
What is a mantra?
It's a sacred utterance or a chant, the Gayatri, which together the Bhagavata then connects itself to both the Vedantic tradition, philosophical, and the Vedic tradition of ritual as embodied in the Gayatri.
So the word Dhimahi means?
Let us meditate. So Satyam Param Dhimahi, let us meditate, let us contemplate that supreme truth.
Some interpreters of the Bhagavata seem to say that the ultimate perfection that the Bhagavata is presenting, promoting, is that one becomes one with that Supreme. Is that your understanding? And if so, how do you understand it from your study?
So this is a question that's been debated for centuries. It's also a question in contemporary scholarship on the Bhagavata. There's no doubt that there's an element of non-dualism, of unity, of non-difference between the individual self, the devotee, and God that is present and taught throughout the Bhagavata, and Advaita. But the characteristics of that Advaita are innocent of Shankara's Advaitic thought. which argues for a much more radical unity between the self and the divine. Rather, the Bhagavata seems to point out that there's this unity of emotion, of will, of direction that is present between the devotee and the divine. And yet, that unity does not detract from the relationship between the two that is so important for bhakti, for devotion.
And the Bhagavata is identifying that supreme truth very specifically as Krishna, right?
Yes.
What more can we say about who is Krishna?
Yes. The Bhagavata, right from the start, highlights Krishna as the main protagonist of this beautiful poem. And this really emerges most deliberately and elaborately in the 10th book of the Bhagavata, which is also the largest of all the books of the Bhagavata and tells the story of Krishna's life. And I think that focus in Krishna really it points to the Bhagavata's emphasis on rasa, the intensified emotion between the devotee and God, and how that's most deeply felt in relationship to Krishna, who is a fount of all different kinds of rasas as he engages in his dalliances in the idyllic surroundings of Braja or Vrindavan, the pastoral setting in which he grew up. And it's that focus, I think, that really emerges early on in the Bhagavata, but finds its fruition in the 10th book.
So Krishna is a name for the Param Satyam, Supreme. And is it any particular reason that that name is identified with Param Satyam, which has a more abstract, generic sense? What does the name Krishna mean?
Okay, the word Krishna has been derived in various ways by grammarians. On one level, Krishna means black, and it's a signification of his bodily color, which is Nila, dark blue, tending on black. The color of a monsoon cloud. If one has been in a country or lives in a country where monsoons happen, you know that when the monsoons arrive, it's a time of great festivity and great joy, and the color of those clouds, as the entire bank of clouds rolls in, is a deep, dark blue, blackish color, and that's the color of Krishna. The word Krishna is also derived from the Sanskrit root krish, which means to attract, and he who is attractive, who brings together all beings, that person is known as Krishna.
Krishna is elaborately described in the Bhagavata Purana. Who is Krishna? In the beginning of the Bhagavata, it says that he is Bhagavan. He is the supreme person. He is the origin of so many avatars, but he is therefore unique. He has what we call lila, many pastimes. These are described throughout the Bhagavata, but most especially in the 10th book out of the 12 books. In the 10th book of the Bhagavata, Krishna is growing up. First, he's a little child who is charming the residents of Vrindavan or Vraja. He meets with so many of his friends as cowherd boys. He tends the cows the calves and the cows. And he also encounters many asuras, or demons, magical beings who have been sent by the evil King Kamsa to kill Krishna. Why does he want Krishna killed? Because there has been a prediction just prior to Krishna's birth that this child will be the cause of his own death. Krishna grows up, he eventually goes from Vrindavan to a place called Mathura, and there he meets with this king who wants to kill him. And there he, Krishna, kills Kamsa. Later on, he goes on to create his own city, Dwaraka, in the western part of what we now call India. And during all of these activities, as described in the Bhagavata, the devotees, the bhaktas, are remembering the wonderful qualities of Krishna, his beauty, his charm, his power, his also renunciation, and then his fame. It's understood that of all beings, the supreme being, the supreme person, is the source of all fame, of all knowledge, of all strength, of all beauty, and also of the renunciation of all of these opulences. So this is Krishna, described, celebrated, and very much made prominent in the Bhagavata Purana.